My name is Nora Lane, and the night he came into my room was the first night I truly felt something other than silence. Not peace, not fear, just life, breaking through the numbness I'd been drowning in for months. The house had been too quiet since my mother died. It creaked at odd hours, sighed through the vents, whispered in places it shouldn't. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty, but watching. I'd inherited the old place because there was no one else left to take it, though inheritance felt like a cruel word. You can't inherit ghosts, you just coexist with them. I moved in a week after the funeral. The walls still smelled faintly of her lavender detergent and the stale tang of disinfectant from the hospice nurse. I'd thought being here would bring comfort, that being surrounded by the memories might soften the ache. Instead, it made everything sharper, like grief had teeth, and this house was its jaw. Nights were the worst. The air always felt heavier after midnight, like it carried every unsaid word we'd ever left hanging between us. I'd lie awake in my childhood room, still lined with faded wallpaper, tiny blue flowers curling at the edges, and count the cracks in the ceiling until the numbers lost meaning. That night, rain was coming. I could smell it before it hit, the metallic bite of thunder rolling somewhere over the hills. I'd left the window open just enough for the air to move, but it only made the house sound alive again. The old maple tree outside scraped its branches against the siding in long, uneven strokes, like fingernails over a coffin lid. I turned on my side, clutching the edge of my blanket, and tried to breathe through the heaviness pressing on my chest. My therapist had told me to let the grief in. But grief doesn't knock politely. It breaks into your house, uninvited, and sits on your bed while you pretend to sleep. It must have been close to 2 a.m. when I heard it, the sound that broke the rhythm of the storm. A soft, deliberate scratch at the door. Not the wind, not the branches, something else. I froze. The scratching came again, a little louder this time. Then a low whimper. For a moment, I couldn't move. I just stared at the door, heart thudding against my ribs, trying to decide if I was imagining it. When the sound came again, something inside me snapped. I got out of bed, the floorboards cold against my feet, and crossed the room. The door handle felt slick with condensation. I hesitated, then turned it. The hall was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the nightlight I'd left near the stairs. And there, standing in the doorway, was a dog. He was soaked through, fur matted with mud, eyes wide and glinting in the dim light. He looked like he'd been running through the storm for hours. For a second, neither of us moved. We just stared at each other, me, a ghost of a woman, him, a ghost of a dog. I don't know what made me step back and open the door wider. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the sheer loneliness that had been gnawing at me since the day they closed my mother's coffin. "Come in," I whispered. He hesitated, paused, shifting on the hardwood, then walked in slowly like he was afraid I'd change my mind. He stopped in the middle of the room, dripping rainwater onto the rug, and looked around. He was a medium-sized mutt, maybe some shepherd in him, maybe retriever. Hard to tell. His fur was the color of autumn leaves, his eyes deep and gold, like he'd swallowed a piece of sunlight and never let it go. When he looked at me again, something in my chest cracked open. I grabbed a towel from the bathroom and knelt beside him. He didn't move as I started drying his fur, only shivered slightly under my touch. His ribs showed faintly through his wet coat, and I realized how thin he was. When I reached his neck, I found a patch of raw skin where a collar must have been. "Someone left you," I murmured. The words hung heavy in the air, and I felt them land somewhere deep inside me. He licked a drop of water off my wrist, gentle and hesitant. It felt like forgiveness. When I finished, I spread an old blanket on the floor near my bed. "You can stay there for the night," I said. He circled the spot once, twice, then lay down with a soft sigh. I turned off the light and crawled back under the covers. For a long time, I listened to the rain against the window and his breathing beside me steady, grounding. Somewhere between thunderclaps, I fell asleep. I woke to the faint smell of wet fur and sunlight. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside scrubbed clean and bright. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then I saw him curled up at the foot of my bed instead of on the blanket, his head resting on his paws. He lifted his eyes when I moved. "Morning," I said softly. His tail gave a tentative thump against the floor. I smiled. It felt strange on my face, like a muscle I hadn't used in months. After breakfast mine, black coffee and toast. His, a hurried bowl of rice and eggs. I searched the neighborhood for signs of where he might have come from. I asked at the corner store, walked down to the park, checked the notice board by the post office. Nothing. By the time I got home, he was sitting by the window, watching the street like he'd been waiting all his life. When he saw me, his tail started wagging slowly, like relief was something he hadn't dared to expect. Well, I sighed. Looks like it's just us. That night, he came into my room again. I'd left the door open without realizing, and when I woke around midnight, I found him standing by the bed, eyes glinting in the darkness. "What?" I whispered. He whined softly, then jumped up careful, tentative, and lay down at my feet. His warmth pressed against me through the blanket, and I didn't have the heart to push him away. Maybe I should have. But the truth is, I didn't want to. Days turned into weeks. I called him Rufus. The name just fit, somehow. He followed me everywhere, room to room, step for step, always close but never intrusive. In the mornings, he'd wait by the kitchen table, head tilted, watching me make coffee like it was the most important ritual in the world. In the evenings, he'd curl up near the fireplace, eyes half closed, sighing like an old soul at peace. He didn't bark much, didn't demand attention. But his silence wasn't empty, it was full of presence, of understanding. Sometimes, when I'd start to spiral when the weight of the house pressed too hard, or the memories clawed their way back, he'd find me. It was uncanny. He'd just know. I'd be sitting on the bathroom floor, shaking, and suddenly he'd be there, resting his head on my knee, steady and sure. I told him things I hadn't told anyone, how I'd hated my mother for being so perfect, then hated myself for hating her, how I'd left everything behind in the city because I couldn't stand pretending to be fine anymore, how every night I still half expected to hear her voice calling me from the kitchen. He never moved when I spoke, just listened, and somehow that was enough. The first time I laughed after the funeral was because of Rufus. It was a quiet afternoon in late winter. I was sitting by the window, sketching aimlessly in an old notebook. He was lying on the rug behind me, gnawing at something I couldn't see. I turned to check and realized he'd stolen one of my slippers. "Hey," I said, trying to sound stern. He froze, slipper hanging from his mouth, eyes wide with guilt. "Drop it!" He didn't. Instead, he trotted to the other side of the room, slipper still between his teeth, tail wagging like a metronome of mischief. I chased him halfway around the living room before collapsing on the couch, breathless, laughing so hard it hurt. He came over, dropped the soggy slipper at my feet, and rested his chin on my lap like an apology. "You're ridiculous," I said, wiping tears from my eyes. He looked up, tongue lolling, and I swear he smiled. That moment stayed with me. It wasn't just the laughter, it was the realization that I still could. That maybe grief wasn't about forgetting, but remembering how to live with the loss. But healing isn't linear. Some nights, the house still felt too large, too alive with the echoes of things unsaid. On those nights, Rufus always came into my room. He didn't wait for permission anymore. The first few times, I tried to stop him, told myself it wasn't normal, that I shouldn't depend on him so much. But the loneliness was a tide, and he was the only thing that kept me from drowning. One night, after a particularly brutal dream, my mother's face, pale and silent in her hospital bed, I woke up shaking. My throat burned with the kind of cry that doesn't make sound. And then, before I could even sit up, I felt the mattress shift. Rufus had climbed onto the bed again, curling against me like he was built for that exact purpose. His warmth spread through me like sunlight through cracked glass. "I can't do this," I whispered into the dark. He nuzzled closer, breath warm against my arm. Not alone. He stayed like that until my breathing steadied, until the shaking stopped. When I finally drifted back to sleep, his head rested against my chest, rising and falling with each heartbeat like he was matching it on purpose. When morning came, I didn't move him. I just lay there, eyes open, hand resting on his back, feeling the rhythm of life humming between us. As winter bled into spring, I noticed small changes, subtle but real. I started leaving the house more, started cooking again. Music returned to the kitchen, low and steady, filling the spaces where silence used to live. Sometimes I'd catch myself talking to Rufus while doing chores. "Do you think Mom would have liked this recipe?" I'd ask, and he'd tilt his head like he was considering it seriously. Other times, I'd catch him staring at me from across the room, that same deep gaze that first night. It wasn't demanding, it was grounding, reminding me I was still here. Then came the night everything cracked open again. It was raining, just like the night he first appeared. I'd been sorting through boxes in the attic, old photos, papers, memories I wasn't ready to face. Somewhere between stacks of letters and dust-covered albums, I found her journal. I shouldn't have read it, but grief makes you do selfish things. The last entry was dated 2 weeks before she died. Her handwriting was faint, shaky. I worry about Nora. She carries too much silence in her eyes. I hope she finds someone or something that brings her back to herself. I stared at those words until they blurred. When I finally went to bed, the house felt heavier than it had in months. I turned off the lights and tried to sleep, but my heart wouldn't slow down. My mother's voice, her smile, her absence, they all collided inside me. And then, through the storm, I heard the softest sound, the creak of the door, the quiet pat of paws on the floor. Rufus came into my room again, just like that first night. No hesitation, no noise. He climbed up beside me, turned once, and settled against my side. I should have told him to go back to his blanket. I should have drawn that line. But when his head rested near my shoulder, when his breathing steadied next to mine, something in me let go. Not because I was weak, but because for the first time in so long, I didn't want to fight the comfort being offered to me. I reached out and laid my hand on his back. His heartbeat pulsed under my palm, strong, certain, real. The storm raged outside, but inside, everything was still. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in months, I didn't dream of loss. I dreamed of warmth, of rain that didn't hurt, of a door that opened in the dark and a soul that found its way in. When I woke, the storm had gone, but the silence it left behind felt almost heavier. Pale morning light spilled across the ceiling, painting faint patterns through the curtains. For a few seconds, I didn't move. I just lay there, half asleep, half aware, feeling the soft weight of warmth pressed against my side. Rufus. He was still there, curled up next to me, his head resting near my shoulder. His breathing was slow, deep, steady, the rhythm of something safe. I turned slightly, my fingers brushing through his fur. He stirred, gave a small sigh, then pressed closer like he'd been waiting for me to wake. For a moment, I didn't think about what came next. I didn't think about the rules or how strange it might look to anyone else. I just breathed in the stillness, the sound of rain dripping from the roof outside, the faint tick of the old clock down the hall, the warmth of his body against mine. It had been so long since I'd felt anything like peace. When I finally sat up, he lifted his head, ears twitching, eyes soft but alert. The sunlight caught in his fur, turning it to gold. "Hey," I whispered. "You snuck in again." "Dan, Bodavin areas, and not as int habis, Bodavin areas and to the day." His tail gave a quiet thump against the bed. Yeah, I said, pretending to scold him. "You're impossible." He stretched, front paws pressing into the blanket, back arching slightly, then looked at me as if waiting for permission to stay a little longer. I couldn't say no. I never could. The kitchen smelled like coffee and toast, the ordinary kind of comfort that fills small spaces with something like hope. Rufus followed me from room to room, patting silently on the wooden floor, occasionally nudging my leg like he wanted to remind me he was there. I opened the back door to let in the morning air. The storm had left everything glistening: the yard, the trees, even the old wooden fence looked alive again. Rufus stepped outside and sniffed the wet grass before trotting out into the garden, tail high. Watching him, I realized how much the house had changed since he came. It wasn't just me anymore. There were paw prints on the floor now, fur on the couch, muddy tracks near the door, signs of life, signs of movement, signs of something staying. I poured another cup of coffee and stood in the doorway, watching as Rufus lifted his face to the light. His fur shimmered with dew. He looked so free, so utterly present, that I felt something ache inside me, something I hadn't named in years. When he came back in, shaking off droplets onto the floor, I didn't scold him. I just laughed an easy, unguarded laugh that startled even me. Days found their rhythm after that. Rufus was my shadow, my quiet companion, my heartbeat against the silence. Every morning, he'd wake before me and sit by the door, waiting. The sound of his tail brushing the floor had become my alarm clock. I'd roll out of bed, groaning at the hour, and he'd nudge my knee with his nose until I smiled. We'd walk the edge of town, the path that curved behind the woods, down by the old railway tracks. Sometimes I'd talk, not even realizing I was doing it. He'd listen the same way he always did, his eyes flicking up at me, patient and knowing. I told him about my mother, how she used to hum while cooking, how she loved storms because they make the air honest. I told him how lost I felt, how heavy it still was to walk through the house and not hear her voice. He never interrupted, never judged. One morning, I found myself saying, "I think she'd have liked you." He looked up, tail wagging once, slow and sure, like he understood exactly what I meant. That spring brought warmth faster than I expected. The days grew longer, and the smell of earth returned. I opened windows I'd kept shut all winter. Light moved through the rooms like breath, brushing over everything I'd forgotten how to see. But healing, I was learning, isn't something that arrives quietly and stays. It comes and goes, like the tide. Some nights, when the house got too quiet again, I'd lie awake and feel the walls closing in. The memories came sharper than the hospital bed, the sound of machines, my mother's last exhale. Sometimes I thought I could still smell her perfume lingering in the hall. Rufus must have known. He always did. Without fail, I'd hear the soft click of his paws on the floor, the gentle creak of the door opening. He'd come in silently, his outline barely visible in the moonlight. Then he'd settle beside the bed, head resting on the blanket near my hand. Sometimes, if the nightmares were bad, he'd climb up beside me, curling close until I felt the tremor in my chest start to ease. He never made a sound. He just was. And I let him be. It was early May when I noticed the first shift between us, not in him, but in me. We were sitting in the yard one evening, the last bit of sunlight dripping through the trees. I was sketching idly in my notebook, trying to catch the way the light hit the branches. Rufus was lying a few feet away, chewing absently on a stick. Then, out of nowhere, I felt this surge of gratitude so strong it almost hurt. Gratitude for him, for this quiet, for the strange new stillness that no longer felt like emptiness. I dropped my pencil and just watched him. The slow rise and fall of his chest, the calm in his eyes when he glanced back at me. "Thank you," I whispered. He lifted his head slightly, ears twitching. "I mean it," I said, smiling through tears I hadn't realized were there. "You saved me, Rufus. You really did." He got up, crossed the space between us, and sat beside me, leaning his weight against my shoulder. I let him. I leaned back, closing my eyes, feeling the world steady around that single point of warmth. When the wind passed through the trees, it sounded like her voice again, soft, unhurried, forgiving. The next few weeks blurred into something gentle. We fell into patterns that felt natural, almost sacred. Walks at dawn, breakfast shared in quiet moments, afternoons spent with the windows open and the sound of the world spilling in. But then came the evening he didn't come when I called. It had been hot all day, the kind of heat that clings to your skin even after sunset. I'd left the back door open to let the air move through, but when I went to close it, Rufus was gone. At first, I thought he was chasing something, a rabbit, maybe, or the scent of the woods beyond the fence. I called his name softly at first, then louder. Rufus! Nothing. The yard felt too still. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the darkness. The beam cut through the air, catching the shimmer of wet leaves, the glint of dew on grass. I walked past the fence, down the narrow path we always took in the mornings. Rufus! My voice cracked, swallowed by the wind. The woods loomed ahead, black and endless. I hesitated, pulse racing. The rational part of me said he'd come back, that I was overreacting. But something deeper, something primal kept me moving. Branches clawed at my sleeves. The air smelled of earth and dampness. My shoes slipped in the mud as I called his name again and again, the sound echoing back in fragments. Then, faintly, a sound. A whimper. I froze, straining to listen. It came again, soft, broken, close enough to guide me. I followed it through the undergrowth until the light caught a shape near the creek bed. Rufus! He was there, half submerged in the mud, one paw twisted awkwardly beneath him. His fur was soaked, his eyes wide but lucid. When he saw me, he whimpered again, tail giving a weak thump. "Oh God," I whispered, dropping to my knees beside him. Carefully, I slid my arms under his body, feeling the tremor of pain ripple through him. "It's okay. I've got you. I've got you." He was heavier than he looked, but adrenaline made me strong. I carried him back up the path, every step a battle against the weight of fear pressing on my chest. By the time we reached the house, my arms were shaking. I laid him gently on a blanket in the living room, my breath ragged. He looked up at me, eyes glassy with exhaustion. "I'm here," I whispered, stroking his fur. "You're safe." He let out a soft sound, a sigh, maybe, or relief, and rested his head against my knee. I called the local vet. He came in the next morning, checked Rufus, gave him something for the pain, wrapped the paw. "A sprain, not a break," he said. "Rest would heal it." But the vet's kindness faded the moment he left, replaced by a different kind of silence, one that settled deep in the chest. Because that night, when Rufus struggled to stand, he looked at me the same way he had that first night. Desperate, trusting, infinite. And I realized something terrifying. I couldn't lose him. Not now. The following days became a ritual of care. I stayed close, making sure he ate, carried him outside when he needed it. Sometimes, I'd sit beside him for hours, whispering nonsense just to fill the air. He grew restless as he started to heal, wanting to move, to run. But the moment I looked at him, really looked, he'd settle again, as if he knew my heart needed the stillness more than he did. The first time he stood on all fours again, I nearly cried. "You did it," I said, crouching beside him. "You're okay." He wagged his tail, slow, proud, like he was humoring me. We went outside together, slow and cautious. The yard was alive with light, the grass thick and bright. He moved gingerly at first, then with more confidence, nose pressed to the earth. Watching him, I felt something deep inside me loosen. It wasn't just relief, it was recognition. The way he'd fought to stay, to live, mirrored the quiet struggle I'd been waging inside myself since the day I came back here. We were both survivors of storms. Both creatures who'd found shelter in each other's broken spaces. One night, not long after, I couldn't sleep. The air was too still, too warm. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything we'd survived my mother's absence, the grief, the near loss. And then I heard it again. The sound of paws on the floor, the soft creak of the door opening. He came into my room quietly, as he always did, but this time, I felt something shift. It wasn't surprise or even comfort, it was understanding. A silent agreement between two souls that had found their way through darkness. He paused at the edge of the bed, eyes catching the moonlight, waiting. I didn't say a word. I just lifted the blanket slightly, and he climbed up, curling against me, head tucked under my arm. His breathing settled into rhythm with mine, slow and sure. I could feel the faint beat of his heart against my skin, steady and real. "I missed you," I whispered. He let out a small sigh, the sound of peace. I closed my eyes, my hand resting on his back. The room felt different now, warmer, fuller, alive again. The storm outside had long passed, but something else remained. A kind of quiet I could finally live inside without breaking. For the first time since coming back to this house, I didn't feel haunted. I felt home. And as the night deepened, the line between past and present, pain and healing, loneliness and love, all of it blurred into one simple truth. Sometimes, when something broken finds you in the dark, you let it in. Not because you're weak, but because you finally understand some doors are meant to open. Morning light filtered softly through the curtains. Golden and slow, touching everything it could reach. Rufus was still beside me, his head heavy on my arm, his breathing deep and even. I didn't move right away. The world outside could wait. It always could when he was here. I let myself exist in that stillness, suspended between sleep and waking, the quiet rhythm of two heartbeats keeping time in a room that used to feel empty. When I finally rose, he lifted his head, blinking at the light, tail brushing lazily against the sheets. "Come on, sleepyhead," I said softly, ruffling his fur. "The world's waiting." He yawned, stretched, and followed me into the morning like he always did. The air outside smelled of spring of earth, warming under sunlight, of something growing again. The garden was alive now, wildflowers sprouting where weeds used to live, grass long and uneven but green as a promise. Rufus bounded across it, nose to the ground, tail high and proud. It was strange to think how much had changed since that first night he came into my room. The girl I'd been then felt distant, fragile, half-formed, afraid of her own reflection. Now I could feel my own edges again, sharper but stronger. The grief still lived in me, yes, but it didn't rule me anymore. It pulsed softly beneath the surface, a reminder of what love leaves behind. Rufus ran back to me, panting, tongue lolling. He dropped a stick at my feet and looked up with that familiar spark in his eyes. "You're relentless," I laughed. "Fine, one throw." The stick arced through the air, landing near the old fence. He tore after it, sunlight catching on his coat, and for that small moment I thought, this is it. This is what peace looks like. But peace never lasts forever. When he came back, his pace was slower. He dropped the stick, tail wagging half-heartedly, and sat down beside me, breathing heavier than usual. I brushed it off at first, thinking he was just tired, the heat may be too much. But when we went inside, he lay down near the door and didn't get up again for a while. I knelt beside him. "Hey, you okay?" He blinked, eyes soft, but his chest rose unevenly. I placed my hand against his side, felt the faint tremor in his breathing. "Okay," I whispered. "We'll rest. Just rest." He closed his eyes, trusting me completely. That evening, I called the vet. He came by the next morning, checked Rufus, ran a hand along his ribs, pressed gently near his heart. His voice was calm, practiced. When he said it, age, he explained, or maybe something congenital. Nothing sudden, just time catching up. "He's still got good days ahead," he said gently. "Just fewer than before. Make them count." When he left, I sat on the floor beside Rufus for a long time, staring at the door long after it closed. Make them count. The phrase echoed like a bell in my head. Rufus stirred, shifting his weight so that his paw touched my leg. He didn't know what the vet had said, or maybe he did in some quiet way animals understand. Either way, he looked at me with that same steady gaze, the one that had saved me once before. And I realized something I hadn't been able to see until that moment. He'd been teaching me how to let go from the very beginning. Every walk, every night he came into my room, every time he'd stood by me in silence, it wasn't just about love. It was about learning how to stay open, even knowing that one day I'd have to say goodbye again. The next weeks unfolded slowly, like a film I didn't want to end. I built our days around him. Morning walks that turned into lazy strolls, afternoons on the porch, evenings spent in the soft hush of fading light. I cooked simple meals, left the back door open, filled the house with small, ordinary sounds, again the hum of a radio, the rustle of paper, the whisper of wind through curtains. Sometimes, I'd catch myself watching him as he slept, his chest rising and falling, the twitch of his paws as he dreamed, and I'd feel that familiar ache building in my chest. Not grief, not yet, but its shadow. One night, while sorting through old boxes, I found an envelope I didn't recognize. Inside was a photograph me at 7 years old, standing in this very yard, holding a golden retriever puppy in my arms. I'd forgotten him completely, the dog we'd had when I was little. His name was Max. He died when I was 12, and I'd cried for days, but life had gone on. Looking at the photo, I realized something I couldn't ignore. Maybe Rufus had never been a coincidence. Maybe life had a way of circling back, offering us what we once lost in forms we didn't expect. When I turned around, Rufus was there, standing quietly in the doorway, watching me. "You found your way to me," I said softly, voice breaking, just like he did. He walked over and rested his head against my leg. I held him, breathing in the faint scent of rain still clinging to his fur. That night, I dreamed of both of them, Rufus and Max, running together through the same endless field, golden light spilling across their backs. My mother was there too, standing in the distance, smiling. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The day it happened was gentle. The sky was pale, the air warm, the world deceptively calm. We were sitting by the window, sunlight pouring through the glass. Rufus had grown slower, his movements smaller, his breaths shallower. But when he looked at me, the light was still there, the same spark, dimmed but not gone. I stroked his fur, humming softly, some tune my mother used to hum when I couldn't sleep. He pressed his head into my hand, eyes fluttering closed. "It's okay," I whispered. "You can rest." He exhaled, a sound so soft it almost wasn't there. His chest rose once more, then still. For a moment, everything froze the air. My pulse, time itself. Then it hit me, a wave that knocked the breath from my lungs. I buried my face in his fur and cried, not the sharp, desperate kind of crying, but deep, aching sobs that came from somewhere beyond words. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Long enough for the sunlight to fade, long enough for silence to settle around us again. When I finally stood, I covered him with the old blanket he'd loved to sleep on. The room felt too still, too full of absence. Yet somewhere beneath the pain, I felt something else, stirring something almost like gratitude. He hadn't just come into my life. He'd come to finish what love had started, to teach me how to stay open even when it hurt, to remind me that connection doesn't die, it just changes shape. I buried him under the maple tree in the yard, the one whose branches brushed against my window at night. I planted wildflowers around the spot, bluebells, marigolds, daisies. The earth smelled rich and alive. When the wind moved through the leaves, it sounded like a whisper, soft and low. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt strange without the quiet sound of his breathing beside me. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound of paws in the hallway that would never come. And then something happened. Maybe it was the wind, maybe my mind, maybe something else entirely, but I swore I heard it. The faint creak of the door, the soft rhythm of steps across the floor. I turned my head toward the window. The curtains fluttered, moonlight spilling across the room. For a second, I saw him there, not in flesh, not in shadow, but in presence. And I smiled. "Good night, Rufus," I whispered. "Thank you." The air stilled again, and the quiet that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was full alive, with every heartbeat, every memory, every breath that had carried us here. Spring melted into summer. The garden grew wild, colors spilling over the edges of everything. The house no longer felt haunted, it felt inhabited, even in its silence. I started painting again. Not portraits or still lifes, but moments, fragments of memory. The first one I finished was of the night he came into my room. The light falling through the door, the storm behind him, his eyes wide and knowing. I hung it above the fireplace, where the morning sun would touch it first every day. Life moved on, slow but certain. I got a job in town, part-time at the library. People began to know me not as the quiet girl who came back after the funeral, but as Nora, the woman who laughed softly, who painted, who smiled at stray dogs. Because yes, they still found me. There was one in particular, a small brown pup that lingered near the fence one afternoon. Thin, nervous, eyes wary but curious. He reminded me of Rufus, though younger, lighter. I watched him for a while, unsure. Then, without really thinking, I opened the gate. He hesitated, sniffed the air, then took a tentative step forward. "Hey," I said softly, kneeling down. "It's okay. You can come in." He approached slowly, tail low, until his nose brushed against my hand. Warm, trembling, real. And in that moment, I understood what Rufus had left behind. Not just memories, not just love, but courage, the kind that keeps the heart open, even after loss. I smiled through the sting of tears. "Just for tonight," I whispered. But deep down, I already knew better. Later that evening, as the sun bled out over the horizon, the puppy slept curled beside me on the porch. The maple tree swayed gently in the breeze, wildflowers dancing at its base. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass, their light flickering like heartbeats in the dark. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the quiet hold me. Somewhere inside that silence, I could almost hear it again. The soft pat of paws, the low sigh of breath, the faint echo of a heartbeat that once matched mine. It didn't hurt anymore. It felt like being watched over, like being understood. When I opened my eyes, the sky was spilling with stars, the kind that only appear when you've learned how to look for them. I reached down, brushing my fingers through the puppy's fur, and whispered the words that had once changed everything. "You came into my room at night," I said softly, voice trembling but sure, and I couldn't say no. The puppy stirred, shifted closer, his tiny heartbeat fluttering against my palm. And I smiled. Because this was what love did. It found you again, in new shapes, in new moments. In the soft persistence of life, refusing to let you close your heart. The wind passed through the garden, carrying the scent of wildflowers and rain. Somewhere, I thought I heard the faint rustle of a tail against the floor, the quiet hum of a spirit still at rest. I turned my face toward the sound, and for the first time in a long, long while, I whispered into the night, "I'm home." The stars shimmered brighter, the trees bent low in the breeze, and the world held its breath for just a moment before exhaling again. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty anymore. And I knew then, as I sat there with the small life sleeping beside me, that love never really leaves. It just changes its form and waits for us to open the door again. Always, it waits.